Mother Bear and her cub show up at your door. Would you dare to open it? It was a quiet December night in Fairbanks, Alaska, the kind where silence presses down like fresh snow. Sarah Walker, a reclusive widow in her late 30s, was sitting by the fire in her remote cabin, sipping chamomile tea and trying to ignore the deep ache of another holiday season spent alone. Her only companion was a framed photo of her late husband, Ethan, smiling back at her from the mantel. But at exactly 11:56 p.m., a loud, desperate knock shattered the silence. Startled, she grabbed the rifle by the door, her pulse racing. Who could possibly be out here, miles from the nearest town, in the dead of winter? Her fingers trembled as she peeked through the frosted window. What she saw left her breathless. A polar bear, a mother, stood on her porch, staring directly at her. Next to the bear, barely visible, was a tiny cub lying motionless in the snow. The mother let out a guttural sound, a mix of growl and whimper, as if pleading for help. Sarah's first instinct was to lock the door and wait for the animal to leave, but something about the bear's eyes, wide, desperate, almost human, made her hesitate. Against every shred of logic, she unlatched the door. Years of living in the wilderness had taught Sarah to respect the raw power of nature, but she had never seen anything like this. The bear didn't charge or growl. Instead, it stepped back, revealing the cub more clearly. The tiny creature, barely alive, shivered violently, its breaths shallow. Sarah dropped the rifle, her heart pounding. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered, as if expecting an answer. The mother bear nudged the cub forward with her nose, then looked at Sarah again. The plea was unmistakable. As the bitter wind bit through her wool sweater, Sarah knelt by the cub, her hands hovering uncertainly. She knew the risks. Polar bears were apex predators, and this could easily be a trap. But something deeper, something maternal and primal, stirred within her. She reached out, gently scooping the cub into her arms. The mother bear watched silently, her breath misting in the icy air. The moment was surreal, like a scene torn from a dream or a nightmare. Sarah stood there, cradling the cub, her mind racing with questions. Why had the bear come to her? What could she possibly do for this fragile life clinging to hers? And as she carried the cub inside, glancing nervously at the mother bear who remained on her porch, she realized she had just crossed an invisible line, one that would change her life forever. Sarah placed the cub on a pile of blankets by the fireplace, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. Its tiny body was alarmingly thin, its fur patchy in places. The cub whimpered softly, its eyes barely opening. Sarah knelt beside it, her mind spinning. She had some experience with injured animals, wolves, foxes, even a moose once, but never a polar bear, let alone a baby one. What on earth was she supposed to do? Outside, the mother bear remained, her massive frame silhouetted against the dark, snowy landscape. Sarah's heart pounded every time she glanced at the window, expecting the bear to break through and reclaim her cub. But instead, it stayed, pacing back and forth with a strange patience. It was as if the bear understood that Sarah was trying to help. Sarah rummaged through her supplies, finding a bottle of goat's milk she had saved for emergencies. She warmed it on the stove and poured it into a small rubber bottle. As she brought the makeshift feeder to the cub's mouth, the tiny creature hesitated, then latched on weakly. Relief flooded through Sarah as the cub began to suckle, its small movements fragile but determined. Memories of her late husband surfaced as she watched the cub. Ethan had always dreamed of a family, but their plans had been stolen by a tragic car accident 3 years earlier. Since then, Sarah had buried herself in isolation, unwilling to open her heart again. Yet here she was, nurturing a life that didn't belong to her, feeling a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Outside, the mother bear let out a low, mournful sound, snapping Sarah back to the present. She hesitated, then opened the door just enough to let the cold air rush in. "I'm doing what I can," she said softly, her voice shaky. The bear didn't move closer, but its eyes held hers for a long moment. For the first time, Sarah felt a strange kinship with the creature, a shared grief, a shared desperation. She closed the door, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but one thing was certain: she couldn't let the cub die. Morning broke with a dull gray sky and the eerie silence of the Alaskan wilderness. Sarah had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the fragile cub and the watchful mother outside. She checked on the cub, now sleeping more peacefully near the fire. The milk had done its job, but the animal was far from stable. She knew time was against her and decided to make the treacherous drive to the nearest town for supplies. As Sarah bundled up and opened the cabin door, she froze. The mother bear was still there, sitting just a few feet away. But what caught her attention wasn't the bear, it was the man standing behind her. He was tall, bundled in layers of fur and carrying a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. His piercing blue eyes met Sarah's with an intensity that sent a chill through her. "That bear's been here all night, hasn't it?" the man asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. Sarah stepped outside cautiously, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded. People didn't just appear in the middle of nowhere, especially during a harsh winter like this. "I track wildlife," he said simply, nodding toward the mother bear. "But this is unusual. That bear isn't acting natural. It should have attacked you by now." Sarah's heart raced. She didn't want to explain what had happened, not to a stranger with a rifle. "She's not a threat," Sarah said firmly. "She's just protecting her cub." The man's eyes narrowed. "You took the cub, didn't you?" He glanced at the cabin, his expression unreadable. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Polar bears aren't pets, lady. And if that cub doesn't make it..." He trailed off, his gaze drifting back to the mother bear. Sarah bristled, her protective instincts kicking in. "I didn't ask for your advice," she snapped. "I'm doing everything I can." The man sighed, lowering his rifle. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. But if word gets out about this, there'll be hunters, scientists, and reporters swarming this place. That bear will be killed and maybe you too." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You need to let them go before it's too late." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that letting go wasn't an option, not yet. The man gave her one last, pointed look before walking back into the snowy forest. As his figure disappeared, Sarah glanced at the mother bear, who seemed more patient than ever. Whatever was happening here, it was far from over. The storm rolled in faster than Sarah anticipated, blanketing the forest in a relentless swirl of snow. Her plans to drive into town for supplies were dashed as the roads became impassable. She stood by the window, watching the mother bear curl up near a cluster of trees, her massive frame half covered in snow. Inside, the cub stirred weakly, its breaths shallow and uneven. Sarah knew she couldn't wait for the weather to clear. She needed help, and fast. She grabbed her satellite phone, dialing the only number she trusted, Dr. Ellen Hayes, a retired veterinarian and an old friend of her late husband. After a few tense rings, Ellen's warm, steady voice came through. "Sarah? Is everything okay?" "No," Sarah said, her voice cracking. She explained the situation as quickly as possible, leaving out the stranger's visit and her growing attachment to the cub. Ellen's tone turned serious. "A polar bear cub? Sarah, they're incredibly fragile at this age. You need specialized milk replacer, hydration therapy, and warmth. Without it, the cub won't make it." "I can't get to town," Sarah replied, panic creeping into her voice. "The storm's too strong. What can I do here?" Ellen hesitated before responding. "You'll have to improvise. Keep the cub warm and hydrated. Use electrolyte solutions if you can." "And Sarah?" Her voice softened. "Be careful. The mother won't wait forever. If she senses her cub is beyond saving, she might turn on you." The call ended, leaving Sarah feeling both determined and terrified. She raided her pantry, mixing a crude solution of sugar, salt, and water to mimic electrolytes. The cub resisted at first but eventually drank from the syringe she offered. Its tiny body twitched as it swallowed, and Sarah's chest tightened. She looked out the window again, her eyes meeting the mother bear's unyielding gaze. "I'm doing everything I can," Sarah whispered. But as the storm howled louder, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a battle she wasn't meant to win. The storm raged on through the night, the wind howling like a relentless predator outside Sarah's cabin. The cub's frail cries had grown softer, and Sarah's anxiety mounted with every passing hour. She had done everything Ellen suggested, keeping the cub warm and hydrated, but it was clear that time was slipping through her fingers. Through the frost-covered window, Sarah saw the mother bear, now nearly buried under a thick layer of snow. Despite the storm's fury, the bear remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the cabin. It was as though she could see straight through the walls to her cub inside. The sight sent a pang of guilt through Sarah's chest. She had taken something precious from the bear, a part of herself she was desperately clinging to. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease, leaving a surreal stillness in its wake. Sarah wrapped the cub in a blanket and sat by the fire, its tiny body resting against her chest. She thought of the stranger's warning, of the danger she might have invited into her life by interfering. But she also thought of Ethan and how he would have understood her need to save this fragile creature, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the door. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she reached for her rifle. The sound came again, more insistent this time. She stood slowly, cradling the cub, and moved toward the door. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with the mother bear. The bear didn't roar or lunge. Instead, it let out a low, mournful sound, almost like a cry. Its massive frame trembled with exhaustion, its eyes pleading. Sarah stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of fear and compassion. The bear leaned closer, its breath fogging the air between them. Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside, leaving the door ajar. The bear didn't enter but remained in the doorway, her gaze shifting to the cub in Sarah's arms. For a moment, there was only silence between them, a fragile understanding that transcended species. Sarah felt tears welling up, the weight of the decision she had to make pressing down on her like the storm outside had. The mother bear stood in the doorway, her massive form outlined by the soft gray light of the overcast morning. Sarah's breath caught as the bear's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of desperation and an almost human grief. The cub stirred weakly in her arms, its soft whimper cutting through the tension like a knife. Sarah knew what the bear wanted. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to protect herself. But something about the raw emotion in the bear's eyes made it impossible. Against all logic, Sarah stepped closer, holding the cub out slightly. "You're here for her," she whispered. The bear sniffed the air, then leaned forward, her massive nose brushing the cub's fur. A soft rumble emanated from her chest, not a growl, but a sound of recognition. Sarah's hands trembled as she lowered the cub onto a blanket just inside the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The bear watched intently, her gaze shifting between Sarah and her baby. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Sarah crouched beside the cub, unsure of what to do next. She thought of Ethan again, how he had always believed in the power of connection, even in the face of fear. "If you give them a chance," he used to say, "even the wildest things can surprise you." The bear nudged the cub gently, her massive paw brushing against the blanket. Sarah's chest tightened as the cub let out a faint, pitiful cry. It was alive, but just barely. The mother bear let out another low rumble, this one filled with urgency. Sarah understood. The bear didn't just want her cub back, she needed help to save it. A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she whispered, "I can't do this alone." The bear didn't respond, of course, but her presence felt like an answer in itself. Sarah knew then that she wasn't just fighting for the cub, she was fighting for both of them. The hours that followed felt surreal. Sarah worked tirelessly, moving between tending to the cub and cautiously observing the mother bear, who remained near the doorway. The cabin was cramped and warm, a stark contrast to the icy wilderness outside, yet the bear didn't seem to care. She watched every move Sarah made with a piercing intensity, as if willing her to succeed. Sarah heated another makeshift electrolyte solution, carefully feeding the cub with the syringe. Its tiny body shuddered, but it managed to swallow, its strength slowly returning. The mother bear let out a soft, rhythmic rumble, her gaze never leaving her cub. It wasn't gratitude, at least not in any human sense, but Sarah felt it all the same. As night fell, Sarah set up a small space near the fire for the cub, using old towels and blankets. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low and unsure. "You can come closer if you want," she murmured to the bear, even as her pulse quickened with fear. The The bear didn't move at first. Then, slowly and deliberately, she stepped forward, her massive paws crunching against the wooden floor. Sarah's breath caught as the bear settled near the fire, close enough to see the cub but far enough not to threaten. It was a moment that defied every rule Sarah had learned about wildlife, yet it felt oddly natural. Hours turned into a strange rhythm of care and observation. Sarah worked to keep the cub alive, while the mother bear remained an ever-present sentinel. At one point, as Sarah rested her head in her hands, exhaustion overtaking her, she thought she saw the bear lower her head slightly in what looked like a moment of shared fatigue. It was a small, fleeting gesture, but it stayed with her. As the fire crackled softly and the cabin grew quiet, Sarah found herself whispering, "You just want her to live. That's all any of us want, isn't it?" The bear didn't answer, of course, but in the silence that followed, Sarah felt an understanding settle between them, a fragile truce born of desperation and hope. The third night brought an uneasy calm. The cub was showing signs of improvement, its weak cries turning into faint but persistent noises. Sarah's exhaustion was bone-deep, yet sleep evaded her. Each time she closed her eyes, memories of Ethan surfaced, mingling with her present fears. She thought of the life they had dreamed of, a family, a home full of laughter, and how cruelly it had been taken away. The cub's fragile fight for survival felt like an echo of her own grief, a chance to nurture what she'd lost. Outside, the forest was a canvas of shadows under a pale moon. The mother bear shifted near the doorway, her watchful presence now oddly comforting. Sarah found herself talking to the bear, her voice soft and unsteady. "You don't understand me, do you? But I think we're more alike than I ever thought possible. We're both just trying to save what matters." The bear blinked slowly as if listening, and Sarah felt a strange sense of connection, wild, inexplicable, but undeniable. Morning came with a startling sound, the crunch of footsteps on snow. Sarah's heart raced as she looked out the window, spotting the same man from before, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He moved cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin. The mother bear let out a warning growl, low and menacing. Sarah stepped outside, her body a shield between the man and the bear. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man raised his hands, his stance non-threatening. "I warned you," he said, words getting out. "Someone saw tracks, maybe even the cub. Hunters are coming. You need to let them go now, or they're as good as dead." His voice was firm but not cruel, and Sarah hesitated. "I can't," she replied, her voice cracking. "The cub's not ready. It won't survive out there yet." The man's expression softened, but his tone remained urgent. "You don't have time, lady. That mother bear's not going to wait forever, and neither are the people tracking her. If they find her here, they'll kill her, and the cub too." The weight of his words settled on Sarah like a fresh snowfall. She glanced at the mother bear, who stood protectively behind her, and at the cub, still weak but alive inside. Every decision she had made up to this point had been for their survival, but now the stakes had shifted. She felt trapped between two impossible choices: risk everything to save them or let them go and hope for the best. The man watched her, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you decide, it has to be soon," he said. With that, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Sarah alone with the crushing reality of what lay ahead. Sarah sat by the fire, staring at the cub, who was now strong enough to stand on shaky legs. The mother bear watched closely from the doorway, her every movement protective and deliberate. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together a plan that felt increasingly impossible. She couldn't abandon them, but keeping them here was a death sentence. She needed to act, and she needed to act fast. Her first thought was the wildlife reserve 50 miles away, a safe haven where injured animals were treated and released. But the journey there was treacherous, especially with a storm predicted to return by nightfall. She glanced at her old truck, buried in snow outside. It hadn't been driven in weeks and wasn't built for transporting a predator and her cub. But it was her only option. She spent the next few hours preparing. She packed blankets, tools, and the remaining supplies Ellen had suggested. The mother bear watched her movements with a mix of curiosity and wariness, her growls soft but constant whenever Sarah approached the cub. "You're not going to like this," Sarah murmured, her voice shaking. "But it's the only way." When the truck was finally ready, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet, convincing the mother bear to trust her. She opened the back of the truck, laying down blankets and leaving the door wide open. Then she carefully carried the cub, who squirmed weakly but didn't resist, and placed it inside. The mother bear growled louder now, her massive frame looming closer. Sarah stepped back, her hands raised. "It's okay," she whispered, her heart pounding. "I'm not taking her from you. I promise." The bear hesitated, her head lowering as she sniffed the air. Slowly, she climbed into the truck, settling next to her cub. Sarah exhaled, relief flooding through her, though her fear remained. The drive would be long and perilous, but Sarah knew she had no choice. She climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. As the engine roared to life, the mother bear let out a low growl, her eyes locked on Sarah through the rearview mirror. It wasn't a look of aggression, but a reminder of the delicate balance they had struck. With a deep breath, Sarah drove into the snowy wilderness, the weight of their fragile lives pressing heavily on her. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope that they might all make it out alive. The drive was a nerve-wracking journey through endless white. The narrow, icy roads twisted through dense forests and open plains, the truck's tires slipping dangerously with each turn. Sarah kept her focus on the path ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the mother bear lay curled protectively around her cub, her massive form taking up most of the truck bed. The storm returned earlier than expected, thick flakes blurring the windshield and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Sarah's heart pounded as she slowed the truck to a crawl, the engine groaning against the wind. Every mile felt like a small victory, yet the reserve still seemed impossibly far. "Stay with me," she muttered, as much to herself as to her passengers. A sudden movement on the road ahead made Sarah slam on the brakes. The truck skidded, sliding dangerously close to the edge of a steep embankment. She cursed under her breath, her chest tightening. A group of hunters emerged from the trees, their rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them raised a hand to signal her to stop. Panic surged through Sarah as she realized the danger. If they saw the bear, they'd shoot without hesitation. She rolled down the window slightly, forcing a calmness into her voice she didn't feel. "Everything okay?" she asked. The leader of the group, a grizzled man with a thick beard, eyed her truck suspiciously. "We're tracking a bear," he said, his tone wary. "Big one. You seen anything unusual?" Sarah's heart raced, but she shook her head. "Nothing out here but snow," she replied, her voice steady. The man squinted at her, his gaze lingering on the truck bed. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might press further, but then he waved her off. "Be careful out here," he said. As the hunters disappeared into the storm, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling on the wheel. She glanced in the mirror, catching the mother bear's watchful eyes. "We're not out of this yet," she whispered, her determination hardening. Hours later, the lights of the wildlife reserve came into view, glowing faintly through the snow. Sarah's chest tightened with relief as she pulled into the gate, honking the horn to signal for help. Staff members rushed out, their eyes widening at the sight of the mother bear and her cub. As the staff worked quickly to transfer the bears into a secure enclosure, Sarah stood back, her body sagging with exhaustion. The mother bear turned once, her gaze meeting Sarah's. It wasn't gratitude in a human sense, but it was something, an understanding, a truce, a shared fight for survival. As the gates closed behind them, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. She had done the impossible, defying fear, logic, and even nature itself. And as she drove away, the storm finally breaking, she realized that in saving them, she had also saved a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever.